Well, I'd like to welcome you hardy bunch. Obviously, winter's around the corner and most people are in front of their little fires, increasing the electricity bill when they could be here enjoying themselves. Now today I'm going to talk about a forgotten, unknown, great Australian hero. I know it's hard to believe, but we're going to talk about Edward Denny Day, D-A-Y. Who was Edward Denny Day? And why has he had such a profound impact on Australian society so many years ago? Well, Mr. Edward Denny Day was born in 1801 in Ireland of Anglo-Irish parents. 1801 is a pivotal year in terms of Irish history because in 1801 Great Britain was formed. Before 1801 the ruling classes in Ireland had their own parliament and the same in Scotland. But in 1801 England, Ireland and Wales became Great Britain. So it's a pivotal moment in British history, right? Now, Edward Denny Day, both his parents died. That's John Day and Charlotte Denny are directly descendant from Henry VIII's most important courtier, Sir Anthony Denny. And his title was Groom of the Stool of Henry VIII. I'll repeat it again. He was the groom of the stool of Henry VIII. And I'm not talking about the stool he sat on, but I'm talking about the stool he made. So it was his job to keep the king clean and entertained while he was on the privy. Okay? Now you would think this would be a job for a lowly servant or a slave. No, this was the most important job in the whole realm because whoever was the groom of the stool of Henry VIII knew all the gossip. He knew who was going to be banished, whose head was going to be cut off, what monastery was going to be raided, because the king's sitting there on the loo, doing his business, chatting away to the groom of the stool of Henry VIII. Okay? True story. You can look it up. So he's directly descended on both sides. On his father's side, he was a Protestant clergyman and big landholder in Ireland. And his mother's side, Charlotte Denny, was also the Anglo-Irish landowner. So a good pedigree. Let's not forget that. Britain was about pedigree. And scum like you and me would never aspire to be the groom, the groom of the stool of the monarch. We wouldn't even be considered, okay? So, now, Edward Denny Day was very close to his mum. Didn't get on with his dad that much. His dad was, this fire and brimstone, clergyman with big land holding. And when his mother died in 1824, when Mr. Denny Day, we'll call him Denny Day from now on, was about 23, 24, at the height of the Typh Wars. Those of you who were here for the Irish Rebellion presentations will remember that in the 1820s there were these vicious wars between the peasants who had been basically starved to death and the landlords. So at the height of the war, the peasants against his dad, he decided to join the British Army. And in those days, there's a great tradition in the British aristocracy. You bought your way into the armed forces. You had to buy your rank. And the great Duke of Wellington, who we all, aspire to emulate, right? He bought 8 ranks before he actually saw any action on the battlefield. Now, poor old, Denny Day didn't have much money, and his old man, I don't think he was very close to him, so he raised £400, and that allowed him to buy the lowest rank in the British Armed Forces, which was an ensign. Now, an ensign had a short half-life because their job was to carry the regimental colours into battle. So you can imagine, here you are with the regimental colours, you've got to hold the colours with both hands, you don't have a sword, you don't have a gun, and every bastard's trying to kill you because they want to get the regimental colours. So they had a short half-life. So initially he was sent to India in 1824, where he joined the 46th Regiment. Now, the 46th Regiment were nicknamed the Red Feathers. And they were nicknamed the Red Feathers because they had a red feather in their cap. But the interesting thing about the 46th Regiment is before they'd been in India, they were in the penal colony of New South Wales and were responsible for some of the most atrocious massacre of Indigenous people. So, poor old Denny Day gets the idea that in order to be rich, you need to go to New South Wales. But he needs to collect more money because he doesn't want to be an ensign and die on the battlefield in India. So he raises another £150 and becomes a lieutenant. And for the next 10 years, he wanders around India, looking after the British Empire, but the British Empire wasn't looking after him. It was after the 46th Regiment, he joined the 62 Regiment, and they were asked to do a forced march of 300 kilometres from one base to another. Now, their leaders asked the authorities to provide them with a ship because they had to go through malaria, typhoid, some of the most disease-ridden places in India. They refused, and over half of the battalion died on the forced march through disease. So when he gets, to Bangalore, he decides he's had enough. He's had enough of being a lieutenant in the armed forces. So he sells, and that's the beauty. He sells his rank. He gets a bit of money that way. It's a commodity. And it's been occurring since the 13th century because you don't want scum like you and me becoming officers in the British Armed Forces. So if you have to buy your way in, only people of pedigree and money can actually get into the armed forces. So he decides in 1834, after 10 years of loyal service to His Majesty, that it's time to come to New South Wales to find his fortune. Because he's getting a pension, because he served 10 years in the British Army in India, and that's a long time for a bloke in those days to survive. So he gets a pension. So he turns up in Sydney town in 1834. Now, Sydney town is a rough place in 1834. There's about 15,000 people. Half of them are convicts or ex-convicts. The other half is there a small number of free immigrants. And there's lots of military personnel. It's still a prison to a significant degree. So when he arrives in Sydney, I'll just give you an idea of what he found himself in. 15,000 people, there were 197 licensed hotels and illegal grog shops. There was one woman to 4 men, so prostitution was rife. Discipline was actually achieved through the lash. There were 6,000 public whippings, with an average of 42 lashes in Sydney in 1834. And in the 1830s, more people were hung in the penal colony in Sydney than were hung in the whole of Great Britain, over 350 over a 10-year period. So this is a tough, brutalising place. As the colony begins to expand, they're beginning to come into contact with Aboriginal people who are offering quite significant resistance. The first people who went down the Hawkesbury as the colony expanded were convict cedar loggers. And in the 1820s to the mid-1820s, they would cut down cedar logs, which they would then flush down the river, and eventually they get to Sydney town. But these were brutalised men. And for sport, they would capture local Aboriginal people, slit their abdomens and roast them on an open fire. They would kidnap women and rape them till they died. They'd kidnap female children and rape them till they died. So the relationship between the local people, who were the Wunara, and the convicts wasn't very good. And many convicts tried to escape to China, because in those days they thought that if they travelled, they'd get to China, they would actually be killed by the local people, or a fate worse than that was they'd actually be returned to the redcoats, the soldiers, who would give them maize and other trinkets for taking the time to capture these renegade convicts. So there's this real hatred between the convicts who were sent down the Hawkesbury to cut the cedar and the local Aboriginal people. So at the same time, we had more free immigrants coming down the Hawkesbury and taking over our land, not for grazing, but for agriculture. And the situation got so heated that the local people were given, the local European colonisers were given muskets by the government. And obviously, this allowed them to deal with the Aboriginal problem. Right? But it gets better. So this is what Denny enters. This is the society he has entered in 1854 as a free man. Not a convict, not an ex-convict, but a free man with a pedigree, a retired army officer with a pension. So the first job he gets is with Mr. McCay, who was the colonial secretary, and him and the new governor, who was Governor Burke, after which Burke Street here in Melbourne is named after Little Burke Street, were in constant conflict. Now, Denny Day was a clerk in the office of the colonial secretary, and he had a great deal of sympathy for Burke, because he was one of these new fangled governors that had been sent to New South Wales. He was a humanitarian who had a great deal of respect for the local Aboriginal people, who was basically sent there to stop the indiscriminate slaughter that was occurring. But there was this constant conflict. You may be governor, but that doesn't give you automatic power. You've got to deal with your own bureaucracy, your own soldiers, your own convicts. The list goes on and on. Now, up till 1833, the only law were magistrates, and they were landowners. So the only people on the bench were the magistrates, and they controlled the interpretation of the law. Because even in the early years in 1812, there were questions being raised in Parliament in terms of the treatment which was being meted out to Aboriginal people. Because under British law, at that particular point in time, this is under law, British law, there's two types of law. You've got frontier law and British law. Frontier law is what actually happens. British law is what, is in the statute book. Under British law, the lives of the blacks were as valued and precious as the life of the highest noble in the land. This was in law. But at the same time, there was this expansion down the Hawkesbury, from the upper Hawkesbury to the lower Hawkesbury, of squatters. Not the nice squatters we have today that squat empty houses, but these were real squatters who basically said, this is mine. They would establish estates outside the limits of British authority. This is the frontier. And basically, most of them would go about getting rid of the local people, bringing in sheep and cattle to a lesser degree, but mainly sheep, because I've said before, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution runs on the sheep's back. Sheep is a great commodity when you don't have refrigeration, because you just send the wool across and make a fortune. So you've got free land if you get rid of the local people. You've got free labour from convicts. So you've got free land, free labour, you've got guns. How can you not make a fortune? Now, not everybody in New South Wales was a total bastard. Like in any society, there's always a minuscule minority which tends to, question things. The first Attorney General in New South Wales was a man called Sax Bannister, who was a humanitarian. And he was there from 1824 to 1826, and he was concerned about the endemic violence between whites and blacks, the atrocities that were occurring, the sexual exploitation of Aboriginal women. He was handed out of office and he resigned in 1826, and he was described in the literature of the day as utopian and naive. That was it, he was utopian and naive, right? This is 1824. So what's happened to Denny Day? What's happened to poor old Denny Day? He's working for this final secretary who he can't stand. He's got a great deal of respect for the government. He's looking for a good job. Because Denny Day, he wasn't a businessman. He wasn't an entrepreneur. And everything he touched turned to shit financially, right? In 1833, the government introduced the role of police magistrate. The police magistrate was employed by the government and was a full-time salaried employee of the government. And the police magistrate was a little bit like a US Marshal on the frontiers. He had extraordinary powers. He could appoint his own constables. He could, it was his job to build a courthouse, a remand centre, a jail, and to bring order and British law to challenge frontier law, which was basically about acquiring wealth irrespective of the costs to the people around it, okay? So he took on this job in 1836. Now, you've got to remember that Sydney was a pretty dysfunctional place, not just in terms of what was happening locally, but it was very dysfunctional in terms of the influence that the nobility in Britain had over the colony. Not only did you get a succession of governors, but what actually happened is that if you had a wayward son or some total fool in your family, you pulled a few strings in Parliament and you sent them to Sydney to get a plum job. Okay, I just want you to remember that. So nepotism was rife. Sydney was noted for two things. It was called the buggery capital of the world because there was, 4 men to 1 woman, and also the corruption capital of the world was known, and the nepotistic capital of the world. So you've got all these losers basically, who have basically been expelled from their own society to come and try to make some money in a society where you get free land and free labour, right? So their ethical and moral principles weren't exactly something that you want to emulate. So Denny Day finds himself in this situation. The first place he's sent to him, I've forgotten. Denny's 34, he decides it's time to have a family. But the trouble is, you've got to marry in your class. This is the period, and there's very slim pickings in Sydney town. You've got, 1 woman, 4 men to 1 woman, and very few. But guess what? Another Anglo-Irish loser had been appointed the Postmaster General of Sydney town, and he had 2 daughters, Margaret and another woman, right? So Denny Day, woos Margaret, and they finally get married. And so they're sent off to Lithgow, which is the end of civilization, European civilization. This is the frontier Badlands. And not only does he, when he arrives, this is Sydney. This is what it was like. When he arrives, he found that the constables that he had been appointed up there, they were corrupt, they were drunk, and they were ex-convicts. They had no interest. The prisoners, the chain gangs, were put into stockades at night, and the police who were basically ex-convicts, would connive with the prisoners in the stockade and let them out at night so they could rustle sheep and cattle and get involved in highway robbery. And obviously, they would get a cut of the profits. So this is what he came into. He had to build a courthouse, he had to build a remand centre, he had to build a jail, he had to find some constables that were trustworthy. As he's beginning to, bring a little bit of order, almost single-handedly, to Lithgow, guess what? Some loser from England is appointed to his job. And he is sent to Maitland, right? Which is an even tougher town than Lithgow. This is the very edge of the frontier. This is where the massacres are occurring. This is where the war Nura, are fighting back. He gets to Maitland, and guess what? He's there for 9 months, and another loser, called Grant, takes over his job, and he's sent to Scone and gets a demotion, and his salary decreases from £250 to £150 a year. Now, at this time, the lad's having a family. Ultimately, Margaret and Denny had 11 children, 6 sons and 5 daughters, all survived, which is unheard of in those days. So the people of Maitland, the good burghers of Maitland, were a bit concerned that the loser that had taken his place was more interested in socialising in Sydney than keeping the bushrangers at bay, right, and keeping a bit of law and order. So eventually he's called back to Maitland and reappointed in late 1937. Now, some other interesting things are happening. In 1837, a law is passed. I mean, you can pass as many laws as you like, but you've got to be able to implement laws, right? And the law that was passed was that you could not acquire Crown land outside the boundaries of the settlement without a licence. Now, obviously, these huge estates, 10,000, 6,000, 8,000 acres, which have been acquired by these, people, they didn't give a shit. And in these estates, it was mainly frontier justice. And remember, the magistrates that were appointed were the landowners. So obviously they do what was necessary to ensure their convicts were docile through floggings, and that whatever happened to the indigenous people was almost irrelevant. They weren't considered to be human. Right? So he finds himself in this situation in late 1847. Now, in 1837, there's a new group forms in the Hawkesbury region, the Hunter River region. They're called the Pioneers of Civilization. Now, by this time, Governor Burke had been recalled to England, and Governor Gipps had been appointed as Governor of New South Wales. Now, remember, this is an important period when the Tories lost power to the Whigs, and you had the growth of the Chartist movement in England, the Industrial Revolution, the workers' rights, the Tolpuddle martyrs. So Governor Gipps was actually a man of integrity. He really wasn't that interested in acquiring wealth. So, interesting. At the same time, you're going to find this incredible. The Beagle turns up in Sydney town. Now, the Beagle is the ship that Charles Darwin was on as he was exploring the world, formulating the theory of evolution. So he's come to Sydney town, he's not very impressed, he hires 2 men and a few horses, and he goes into the hinterland in order to see a kangaroo. There's no kangaroos left in Sydney, around Sydney, right? And when he gets there, he's pretty disgusted with what he sees. He says things like, and this is in his diary, "I leave Sydney without sorrow or regret." He says things like, "The female convicts or female ex-convicts pass on the vilest language and vilest habits to their children." And he says a lot of. He did meet some Aboriginal people. He was very impressed, especially by their physical, how healthy they were, and how skilled they were in utilising the weapons they had. So he's not very impressed. And then he makes one exceptionally important statement, which actually gives you an indication of what was happening in New South Wales at that time. And when you look at Australia in 2015, not much has changed. He said, everybody, both rich and poor, in the colony are hell-bent on acquiring wealth. Now that's been our motto, Mammon, since the beginning of colonisation. So these expansions into Aboriginal land was about creating profits for a minuscule minority. Right? This was 1837. Now, in late 1837, when the pioneers of civilisation write to Governor Gibbs and tell him that the Kamilaroi, which is one of the big groups in the lower Hunter Aboriginal groups, have amassed a group of 1,000 warriors to attack the settlement, he sends Major Nunn, who's a Waterloo veteran in his mid-40s, with 23 mounted troopers to maintain the peace. Governor gives the strict instruction they're only to use their cutlasses, swords, to fight. But obviously, in the heat of battle, right, people say that between 500 to 300 Kamilaroi were slaughtered in an encounter. You love the date, the 26th of January 1838, Australia Day. A good thing to remember when they talk to you about Australia Day. Now, Lord Glenning, who was responsible from the British Parliament for the colonies, was pretty pissed off, and he asked Governor Gibbs to hold an investigation into the slaughter. Now, at the same time, information filtered out about a massacre of elderly men, women, and children at Mile Creek, which is about 200. Yeah, that's all right. About 200 kilometres from about 200 kilometres from Sydney town. Another interesting fact is that what happened, I'll explain what happened around that particular time. It's very important because it highlights the nature of the land and the brutality of the time. So what happened was that on the 10th of June, 1838, a posse of 12 men on horseback rode up to the Mile Creek section. Yeah, the Mile Creek.
Don't you bring in trolley loads of slabs?
Yeah.
So why are we going to sit on the other side?
No, it's just sit here. It's all right. Come and sit on the other side. Yeah, sit on the other side. Yeah. Oh, this is a pub. It's a working pub. Yeah. People need to remember that. It's a working pub. And yes, costs nothing. All right. So let's go. And we do no editing, so we want people to see it's real. All right? So, we've got these men ride up to the Mile Creek outstation. The Mile Creek outstation is part of the Danga estate. Big estate, basically owned by Danga, who is disgraced surveyor who basically surveyed the land and then took it over for his own needs, right? He was actually disgraced. I think it was he must have stepped on some rich bastard's feet, right? So they ride up. Now what had happened the previous day is that William Hobbs, who was a free man and the overseer of much of the Danga estate, and one of his stockmen, I think his name was Burrows, had gone out to look after some cattle, right? And the Mile Creek station, outstation, was left in the hands of 4 people. There was George Anderson, who was the hut keeper. There was Mr. Kilmeister, who was a stockman. And there were 2 Aboriginal brothers. And their European names were David and Billy, but I usually don't use European names, and although I may mangle the pronunciation, they were the 18-year-old was Yip Tay Tinin, and the 14-year-old was called Puimanga. Right? They were part of the Wirra-Array clan, which was a sub-clan of the Kamilaroi. Now, Killmaster the previous week had invited these Aboriginal people to come and camp at the outstation because most of them were personally known to the men by European names, right? And about 40 turned up. Now, the day before the posse arrived at Mile Creek, the men in the Aboriginal group were offered work at an adjoining station called Newton, and they left that morning. Now that afternoon, we will see and hear about one of the most grotesque elements of Australian history. So what happened is that when the posse arrived, there were a number of old men, there were women, and there were a lot of children. There were 28 people, some say 32, half of them were children. So what happened is when the posse arrived, their hands were tied behind their back, then a rope was attached to each Aboriginal prisoner, and then they were marched to a stockade about 800 metres away. Now, Yip Tay Intin and George Anderson were told to mind their own business, and to ensure they minded their own business, they left 2 Aboriginal women behind for them. Right? At the same time, 2 boys had 6, I think, and 8 had run into the bush, and George Anderson, who was very friendly, he was a lifer for a burglary. George Anderson, he hid a 3-year-old girl in the hut. Now, after they led away, what happened was so grotesque that there are few written records left. And what happened was, and these are eyewitnesses, other members of the Wirraway, eyewitnesses, what happened was that the men were roasted on an open fire while alive after their penis and testes had been removed. This is why they're alive. And these are elderly men. These are not warriors. The warriors are working up the road, right? One's up the road. The women were repeatedly raped, and then they were bayoneted or speared through their vaginas and left to die. The children, we're told, were buried, and then there was a competition by the 12 men to see who could kick the head of a child the furthest. Right? And then each and every one of them had their heads cut off. these were not warriors. This was not a battle. This was a massacre. This is commonly known as the Mile Creek Massacre. Now, the Mile Creek Massacre could have just been another massacre. Could have disappeared from the history books. Could have been a little bit of an oral history tradition amongst the Wirra Away, which was the clan that was massacred. But what happened is that when William Hobbs returned, this is the freeman who was the supervisor, returned the next day, George Anderson told him that the Aboriginal people had been taken away. And he was concerned about their welfare. So he walked down to the stockade and the dogs were eating the bodies of the children and women and men who'd been mutilated, because Killmeister, who had invited the Aboriginal group to camp there, was one of the perpetrators of these atrocities, and he was given the task of burning the remains, but he was too lazy. He was too lazy. It's a big job to, burn the remains of 28, 30 people. And so there's skulls littered everywhere. There's an incredible stench. So even a man as hardened as William Hobbs thinks this is an outrage. He can't leave the outstation, so he calls in a man called Fred Foote, believe it or not. And he was the owner of an adjoining cattle station. When Fred Foote sees what's happened, looks at the mutilated bodies, the heads which are lying around, the stockade, he decides that he will report this to the police magistrate. So in those days, the murder of Aborigines was seen as a trifle concern. Nobody cared, nobody investigated. Of all the squatters, the only squatter among hundreds who showed any compassion, any interest in the Aboriginal people, the Wunara, was a man called William Ogilvie, who was an ex-naval retired officer. He learnt their language, they camped on his estate, and he protected them. And if you look at the history books, that name will come up. Another name that comes up of a humane magistrate and landowner was a man called Forbes, who Forbes is named after. All right? So, but nobody cared. It's of no interest. Now, Mr. Foote rode on his horse to see the new police magistrate, Denny Day. But Denny Day was out doing Denny Day work, enforcing the law. So Mr. Foote was so disgusted that he actually rode to Sydney, which is almost 200 kilometres away, and it takes a good horse in those days, and I'll talk about the horse in a second, would ride about 60 kilometres, and to actually report the massacre directly to Governor Gibbs. Now, the massacre happened on the 10th of June, 1838. Remember that day, right? Now, Governor Gibbs was so revolted that he called in Denny Day to see what could be done. Denny Day arrived in Sydney on the 3rd of July. And Denny Day had an option, because the massacres that had occurred outside the British boundaries, there was no legal compulsion for him, irrespective of what the governor said, to actually investigate the massacre. But on that day, he decided to investigate. And at the end of July, a lieutenant pack, 8 constables, trusted constables for a change, and Denny Day rode out to the stations. And when they arrived, people were shocked. Why was the government concerned about this? They're only black people. They're orangutans. These are the words that we use. They're of no interest to anybody. People thought it was a bit of a comic thing. And Denny Day felt a little bit aggrieved. And over the next 10 days, he and the 8 customers and Lieutenant Pack arrested 10, no, 11 of the perpetrators of the massacre. And I'll try to remember their surnames. There was a bloke called Blade. There was Blade. There was Blade. No, I don't look at the book. It's cheating. Now, I have this in my head. There was Blade. There was a bloke called Lamb, Passier, Toulouse, Harry, Foley, Kilmeister, Johnston, Oates, and I think that's the 11. They were all arrested within 10 days. But the landowners were a bit unhappy about this, especially Mr. Danga, who owned the station, because they thought this was a bit too close for comfort. So there were shots fired at the posse. There were cattle stampeded in their direction. And George Anderson, who decided to tell what he knew, because he was totally pissed off because they had given him the wrong Aboriginal woman. He was in a relationship with a woman called Hapita, and she was one of the ones that was massacred. And he was angry, very angry about what had occurred. It's unusual for people to turn King's evidence or Queen's evidence, because you've got to remember that it was the 20th of June, that's right, 20th of June 1838, that Queen Victoria was made Queen of Great Britain. And that was the big news in the local newspapers. So they eventually get 11 of the 12 to the watch house in Maitland. Now remember, these are all convicts and ex-convicts. Most of them are convicts. I think there's one ex-convict, but most of them are convicts. But the leader of the pack, a free man called Henry Fleming, nowhere to be seen. He'd gone back to his brother's estate where they hid him. He disappeared for a few months, out of sight, out of mind. It's all very well arresting convicts, but you're not going to arrest a free man. You're not going to go to that trouble because you know he's never going to be convicted or even appear before a jury. So the leader, a 22-year-old, I think it was called Henry James Fleming, escaped scot-free. Now, normally in these situations, right, you would find that these men would never come to trial, because previously massacres had occurred and nothing had happened. Now, when Denny Day, the police magistrate, arrived at Mile Creek, there were still the skulls, the beheaded skulls and the flesh hanging off them were still in the stockade. The stench was still there. And what he did, which changed the course of history, he picked up the rib of a 3-year-old child and wrapped it up in a handkerchief and took it with him as evidence. Now, what happened is that the local landowners were livid. They couldn't believe that their men had been arrested for this trifling matter, because currently they were involved in a war of extermination against the indigenous inhabitants. They used smallpox, poison, massacres, whatever was at hand to get rid of this noxious vermin on their land, as they saw it, right? But, guess what? The political tide had changed. The government in England, the Tories had been replaced by the Whigs. There was a call and pressure on Gibbs to ensure they stood trial. Now, the Attorney General, who'd been appointed, I think, after the Bannister, believe it or not, an Irish Catholic called Hubert Plunkett. And those of you who live in Melbourne will remember the name Plunkett, because he was one of the surveyors there. So Hubert Plunkett was the Attorney General. And Hubert Plunkett was insistent that these men come come to trial. So they were taken to the Supreme Court in Sydney. In the middle of November, in front of the Supreme Court Justice Dowling, was a trial of the 11 men before a jury of their peers, because Hubert Plunkett had changed legislation to allow 3 people to be on juries. Right? So we had a jury trial. Obviously, the lads and lasses, mainly the lads, the squatters were a bit concerned, and they set up, if you like this, Hunters River Black Association. And the role of the Hunters Rivers Black Association was to raise money to defend these 11 employees. And they got the best legal brains in Sydney at that particular time to represent them. Now, George Anderson was now under police guard because his life was in danger. Because people knew that if they got rid of George Anderson, there'd be no case. But he was under police protection by Mr. Denny Day and his constables, and he eventually arrived at trial. He gave compelling evidence, and the jury retired. And guess what? 15 minutes later, they returned a not guilty verdict. But this is the important point. It's got ramifications around Australia. What happened was that Hubert Plunkett wasn't as stupid as people thought he was, the Attorney General. He had only laid certain charges against the 11 men. He didn't lay all the charges. I think the charges he laid was that they had killed Big Daddy, who was the senior elder, who'd been roasted alive, and they'd killed an indeterminate number of women and children, right? Now, so what he did is, which I don't think you get away with today, what he did is he ordered a re-trial of what he believed were the 7 most guilty of the 11. And they were charged with murdering Charlie, who was another Aboriginal elder, that was his European name, and unknown children. Remember this, unknown children. They were charged with 20 counts of murder. Now, the 7 that went up for trial were again before a jury of their peers. And if I remember correctly, there was Foley, who should have known better. Foley was a white boy, which is basically an Irish rebel. And they were called white boys, not because they were white, because they wore white sheets to hide their identity when they raided the landlord's property, or the landlord houses. Mr. John Johnston was an Afro-Caribbean black man. Should have known better. There was Johnson, Oates, Blade was not there, Lamb was not there, Palisade was not there, Toulouse was not there, but there was, let's get this right, there was Foley, there was Johnston, there was Kilmeister, there was Parry, there was Oates, Henry Oates, and 2 others. I'll go through it again. Memory is a bad thing. Foley, Johnston, Kilmeyer, Oates. I know Lamb wasn't there. Palisade wasn't there. Toulouse wasn't there. Russell, who I forgot to mention in the first batch, Russell. And they were tried before a new judge. You can't use the same judge. Or judge before Judge Burton, right? Same evidence. Anderson gave his evidence. Day gave his evidence. And he pulled out the rib. The rib of the 3-year-old for the massacre. somehow this must have triggered some degree of sympathy among the jury. And they found them guilty of 5 of the charges of murder of the children. Guilty of 5, not 15. Now, the jury foreman was a little bit confused, and he said initially they were not guilty. This is after a 3/4 of an hour deliberation of the jury, and they all celebrated. But then a juryman kind of pointed out, no, they are guilty of 5 of the offences, right? So, Judge Burton, gave sentence, and the only sentence you have for murder in 1838, at the end of 1838, is hanging. And the 7 men were hung in December of 1838. Let's see if I can get them right. There was Foley, there was Johnston, there was Kilmeister, there was Russell, there was Oates. You don't remember the 7th one, do you? No.
I remember Oates because Oates was the hall.
Yeah, there was one.
Simpson gave him character.
Now, the other 4 were still held in for a future trial because the evidence against Blade, Lamb, Pelissier and Toulouse wasn't as strong, right? And they were relying, this is the fascinating, they were relying on the evidence of the 18-year-old boy, and his name, as I said, was Yip Tay Intin. They were relying on his evidence. There was one problem. Aboriginal people could not give evidence in the European court. In 1838, Hugh Plunkett, the Attorney General, put the proposition to the Parliament, and they rejected it. It was rejected again in 1849, and it wasn't until 1878 in New South Wales that Aboriginal people had the right to speak in court. So the fascinating thing was, if it wasn't for Day's investigation and the fact that he took the British justice seriously, that under British justice, as the sentencing judge says, he said that under British law, the life of a black is as valued and precious as the life of the highest noble in the land. That was supposedly, but as you know, justice is an elusive thing. You know, you've got laws, then you've got a judiciary, you've got a government, and you've got people that actually apply the law to ensure that people appear in courts. And what Day did is, to his great, what he did is, he went against the community that he actually served, because he believed that this was a totally unprovoked attack. Now, guess what happened to Yip Tay Intin? He disappeared. So Lamb, Toulouse, Pelissier, and Blake went free. But the other 7 were hung. But the important thing is, nobody went looking for John Henry Fleming, the free man who was the leader who cajoled these convicts into becoming part of this posse, which had possibly killed other Aboriginal people in the days before this. He disappeared. He was actually in plain sight. Everybody knew where he was. Everybody knew where he was. Now, Denny Day's career takes off. He leaves Maitland and the local burghers. Did we find the name of the city?
Yeah.
It's in Sydney.
Kilmeister, Hawkins, Johnson, Harry, Foley, Oates and Russell.
Yeah. Russell, the one. Yeah. The 7 that were hung. But the thing is, they hung the wrong people. The people who were ultimately responsible were the squatters. These were just convicts who were doing what they were ordered to do by Henry James Fleming. So it wasn't justice. it was a way of actually appeasing the British authorities. But the difference was that from now on, the open slaughter of Indigenous people in New South Wales and what was then Victoria's part of New South Wales was no longer an accepted thing. It had to be done behind closed doors. So no, what was open destruction became a hidden war. And to many degrees, that hidden war, frontier war, which continued for another 100 years, is the very essence of the collective amnesia we have as a people regarding what happened. Because if you look at the early days, you will find references to massacres as if they are commonplace, everyday events which are needed to expand the colony. Occasionally the state gets involved, but usually it's frontier, let's describe this frontier justice, as we saw in the American colonies and to a lesser extent, in Canada, to a significant degree in South America. So you've got this, the colonising power and its laws, and those on the other side, as Mr. Darwin said, would do anything to make a buck. And that's what it was. So, what happened to Mr. Day, Denny Day? Well, he was appointed in 1849 as the Chief Magistrate of Sydney. Right? The government of the day felt so highly about the fact that he applied the law, he went beyond the call of duty, blah, 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 and he was appointed. But he blotted his copybook. In 1851, at the gala ball, which was held by the mayor who he couldn't stand, he got drunk and disorderly. And he was fired as the Chief Magistrate of Sydney Town. 2 years later, the new governor, it's all right, the new governor, as long as he doesn't knock off the camera.
Come on. Move. Aussie.
Do you want to check the camera, Paul, to see if it's still...
Yeah.
All right, yeah. So the new governor of Fitzroy felt sorry for him. Governor Fitzroy, the new governor, which Fitzroy is named after, Governor Fitzroy, he appointed him as the police magistrate at Port Macquarie. He eventually returned to Maitland. He was instrumental in knocking out the Bush Ranger menace in 1841. A few years afterwards, still at Port Macquarie. He was responsible for the arrest of the Davies gang, which was a gang of Bush Rangers which had gone a little bit beyond the pale. Usually Bush Rangers didn't kill people, these did, and 6 of them were hung. And he continued to be the police magistrate at Maitland till about 1867, and he had a stroke in 1869, and he spent the last few years of his life in a miserable condition, and he died in 1874 at the ripe old age of 75, and he left a wife, his wife Margaret, who survived him, 6 sons and 5 daughters. At his funeral, which is fascinating for a man who was held in such high esteem, the only people who had turned up at his funeral, it's funny how people forget, were his family and 2 friends. Now let's look at the life of John Henry Fleming, the instigator of the massacres, at the request of his brothers. Let's look at the life. Well, he married Margaret. They didn't have any children. He became a respected farmer at Wilberforce. He became a church ward in 1862 of his local church. He was appointed to the Magistrates' Court in 1882, 20 years later, as a respected magistrate. He died in 1884, around the age of 70 or 78 or something. And he got a spectacular funeral. All the community was there. There was an honour guard of the local school children. Wonderful words were said about this great pioneer of civilization. So history is a fascinating way. Now I would like to thank Terry Smythe, Smyth. Now Peter has brought the book about Denny Day. Much of the material I've spoken about today comes from this book. It was written in 2016. And what got Mr. Smythe interested in the case was nobody knew about Denny Day. And when he went to the Glebe Cemetery at East Maitland to look at Denny Day's, his burial place, the cross had fallen into the gravesite. Nobody knew. 1874. If it wasn't for him, there would have been no trial, there would have been no guilty verdict, there would have been no exposure of what was going on. What was going on didn't stop, but it was hidden. It was a hidden frontier war, which to a significant degree, you bury the evidence, you burn the evidence. In those days, people did it openly, and it was accepted as part of the past. To give you another example before I finish, you've heard of the term bushwhack. I think it's a nice term, don't you? Well, bushwhack, you don't. A bushwhack was a term which was used in the 1830s and 1840s in the Hawkesbury region, and it denoted, our friends were a little bit, homesick. They, you ride horses, you got hounds and you got foxes. Well, there were no foxes. So they used to have bushwhacks at night where they'd hunt and kill Aborigines of all ages. Children, adults. It was a sport, hidden sport, the bushwhack. And what's interesting is that in 1835, the New South Wales authorities passed legislation to ban cockfighting, bull baiting and bear baiting, but no legislation to ban bushwhacking. So all I can say is, thank God for people like Denny Day. They exist in every generation. They may be at the margins, they may be unrecognised by later generations, but it's the courage that they show, whether they're a police officer or somebody at a Palestinian protest, it's the courage they show which indicates that in every generation there is always a small minority that actually fights for significant justice and change in society. And if you're part of that, well and good, and if you're not, it's about time you join us. Amen. Any questions?
Thank you for that.
I mean, it's a scattered history, but without the research done by Terry Smith, I would have known nothing. I knew nothing about Denny Day. I had no idea. Peter knew a little bit, but I knew nothing because he's a New South Wales chap. But I knew about the Mile Creek Massacre, the court case, the impact it had on the hanging of Tunaminaway and Morgana, and all those things. But I knew nothing about Denny Day. And as I said, in every generation there is a Denny Day. It doesn't have to be a police officer.
The best reading I've found, the Herald Sun and the Age did an apology at Mile Creek in 2023.
Right.
And they did a series of 7 articles, so you can look up Mile Creek apology, Herald Sun. And Sydney Morning Herald, sorry.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be the Herald Sun, mate.
Yeah.
I thought Murdoch's changed. I mean, they were involved in the, the war that in 2004, my late wife did an exhibition called Up Yours. Her exhibition was called A Fact is a Fact is a Fact, Up Yours Wind Shuttle. Because remember, during the Howard regime, there was revisionist history, which was taken as real history. But nothing happened. The evidence is there. Nothing happened.
That's right. And then, anyway, the article on Denny Day and the rest of they call it the heroes of Mile Creek, and it's all the guys who stood up for justice. Really
Plunkett, Day, Gibbs, all those Hobbs, William Hobbs, Foote. So it all fitted in together because the atrocities were just so horrific that even in a brutalised society like that, this was beyond what we describe as beyond the clear. It's not the type. Maybe you do it to a warrior, but this is different. You know?
All those heroes had a very sorry end of their lives
Yeah.
because they were ignored, could be a job or whatever.
That's right.
And Denny Day, I didn't realise the job history of Denny Day afterwards.
Yeah.
He didn't mention Mile Creek in his final writings or in his funeral service.
No.
Mile Creek wasn't mentioned at all.
No.
It was just a bad thing. Nobody
Well,
put it all underground.
the evidence was so horrific that it wasn't even included in some of the court transcripts. That's how horrific it was. A Dante's Inferno on earth. I mean, the things that happened on that day. These were ordinary human beings. These weren't murderers. These were just ordinary people who'd been sentenced for burglary. These were convicts. Some were lifers, some weren't. Lamb had actually been part of the attack on the Camilla a few months earlier. See, these are not hardened.
You got to remember, leading up to Mile Creek, there was Baraba.
Yeah.
It's in the 2 years leading up to Mile Creek. Baraba was 80. It's about 100 or 60 k south of Bingborough Mile Creek. Then there was Slaughterhouse Creek, about 200. Gravesend, around about 200. Waterloo Creek, the Australia Day Massacre, I think it's around about 300.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's in the Union New South Wales is 40, but there's other reports that say it's 300. So that's over 800 Aboriginals killed that are documented by newspaper or official reports from Nunn or whoever.
That's right.
And then, so I don't call Mile Creek a massacre anymore or a mopping up exercise. They were just going through filling up all the little quiet ones.
Yeah, it was a war of extinction. I wanted to actually, it was a war of extinction. Die out, die out rapidly. Because people complain, I used to say, why did they do that? Why didn't they just give them arsenic? Because if you arsenic poisoning is very similar to dying from typhus. And so you just write it off as typhus, the people say this is, I mean, even that hardened, I mean, you're talking about warriors, you're talking about guns, you're talking about spears, you're talking about battles. But this was something totally
anyone
different.
shot fired.
Yeah.
This was like cutlass.
That's right. Yeah. Burning. Yeah. Cutlass. Just horrific. Yeah. It proves. I mean, if you look at what happened in Kampuchea during the Pol Pot regime, what happened in Russia during the Stalin era, what happened with the Nazis, what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza as we speak, it highlights that as human beings, if people don't stand up, we are capable of war. Well, thank you very much. I will now turn off the camera.